if you sincerely desire to achieve enlightenment, this is a lesson or a teaching or an attitude that we must master that is of the utmost importance. It's very hard to describe because it seems as though it's one of those abstract things that once described becomes crystallized into something, and we tend to look at it with the attitude of, oh, that's it and there's nothing more. I hope that there's some way that you can understand that there's no way possible to explain the complexity and the depth and the breadth of the insight that I'm about to describe that you must have in order to truly understand your practice, or in order to even think about achieving enlightenment and even beginning practice. It is a teaching that is worthy and worthwhile for both advanced practitioners, sometimes more for advanced practitioners, and also for beginning practitioners. It has to do with an attitude and a state of mind. It has to do with an inner posture. And the inner posture is complex enough to need describing and to need meditating on. It's one of those things that cannot be described in a few sentences and then left at that. It must be thought about a great deal. First of all, in order to understand what I'm about to describe, I need to restate one of Lord Buddha's most basic teachings. And that is that all sentient beings wish to be happy. That sounds like the most basic of all possible teachings. Yet, we think of other people and we think of how they've acted toward us, and they think that what they have done to us, and we think of all of the different experiences that we've had with other people that have been good for us, but also those that have hurt us. We think of animals, we think of sentient beings that we have no recognition of as being feeling entities, and we don't recognize that they very much wish to be happy. We don't take into account their sentient beinghood. We don't take into account often their humanity. We have no real respect for them. We think that those that have hurt us really want to hurt us. We really do not understand that, in fact, they only wish to be happy. And so that's one of Lord Buddha's most important teachings, and one that we cannot forget if we ever hope to have any compassion at all. And that is that all sentient beings wish to be happy. And the flip side of that teaching is that while they wish to be happy, they do not know how to accumulate the causes of happiness. And that is a most extraordinary teaching, a most insightful teaching. Of all the many observations one could have made about this world, I think it takes a Buddha to make a simple and yet amazingly profound observation such as that. In our lives, we engage in a lot of activity. We do a lot of things. We keep extremely busy. We're always working hard. And even when we're not working hard, we work hard at doing that. I don't know what it is with us, but we manage to be completely involved with our own lives to the extent that we are convinced that our activity is extremely meaningful. But according to the Buddha, upon examining that activity, we find that most, if not all, sentient beings, until they attain enlightenment, are constantly involved in actions that do not produce happiness. In fact, that work contrary to happiness. It's hard for us to understand this most simple teaching and its ramifications. First of all, it's very difficult to look at other sentient beings, especially those that are involved in what we might call negative behavior. For instance, we might look at a person that robs people, a thief. Or we might look at a murderer. Or we might look at someone that is brutal to other people. Or we might think of somebody that is tight and closed and negative. And we might look at these people, and our automatic internal judgment before we come to understand them is that they're just mean somehow. that there's just something wrong with them. We have no understanding that they really want to be happy. And even the murderer wants to be happy, but somehow is so completely deluded that he thinks this control over the life and death of other people will bring him happiness. In his deluded and twisted way, he is trying to be happy. It's true of people that brutalize people. They're so afraid, they're so deluded somewhere deep inside, that they feel that brutalizing others, that power, will bring them peace or happiness or strength, and they feel that strength will lead to happiness. But it's also true of people that are nice to other people. It's also true of people that are extremely self-absorbed. People who think of nothing other than their own happiness. I know very well of a case of a person who is chronically depressed, chronically and consistently depressed. If that person's actions are examined, we'll find that this person is constantly involved in the very activities that produce unhappiness. He or she is thinking only about themselves. They are thinking only about what they should have to make them happy. They think only about what they can do to alleviate their own suffering. They are, in a very peculiar and difficult to understand way, extremely contracted and self-absorbed. This person does not realize it, but is constantly producing the causes for more suffering on a moment-by-moment and day-by-day basis. And it continues. It never ends, and it cannot end until the causes for happiness are produced. Because here in this world, and in any other world that I know of, 2 and 2 always seems to make 4. And apple trees always tend to produce apples. They never produce bananas that I know of. And the causes of unhappiness always produce unhappiness. What is it about the fixation upon the self and what I want that continually produces unhappiness? What is it about the fixation on my needs and what I must have and how I must get you to supply it that perpetuates my unhappiness? What is it about manipulating circumstances to produce a scenario that I think will make me happy that constantly produces unhappiness? It's difficult to understand, but the more that we engage in that kind of activity, the more we become chronically, compulsively obsessed with the reality of I nature, of ego. The more we concentrate on that kind of self-absorbed activity, the more rigid the ego becomes. The more rigid and unbending the ego becomes, the more we suffer. And Lord Buddha teaches us the reasons for that. They're very easy to understand. You see, that ego nature, that artificial construction that we have made up about ourselves, this belief in self-nature as being inherently real, this belief that this is what it is, that this thing that we're looking at is all she wrote. This belief is a false assumption. Therefore, all of our activity, if it is the activity of self-absorption, is based on a false assumption. You might as well be doing like that commercial on TV that I saw the other night, which I thought was wonderful. was a commercial about a hotel. I don't know the name of the hotel, but the people are lying down in the dust pretending that they're swimming because the hotel doesn't have a pool. As likely as they're feeling quenched and relaxed and refreshed by lying down in the dust, kicking their feet, pretending they're in the pool, as likely as that is the likeliness that we can rely on this artificial construction of self and all of the manipulation that it takes to make us happy. It's much like that. It's the same kind of activity based on compulsion and delusion. Not only are we constantly reinforcing the ego and contributing to its rigidity, but we are also, through self-absorbed activity, constantly reinforcing the belief in the distinction or the separation between self and other. And other, then, which includes all phenomena, all sentient beings, all that is not termed self, even one's own feelings and thoughts. All other, then, becomes as solid and as real as the artificial construction of self and the rigid belief and adherence to self. The belief in and adherence to self. Other becomes that real. Of course, the Buddha also teaches us that just as self is an artificial construction, and that one's nature, which is a true nature and a vibrant nature and a luminous and uncontrived nature, is a nature that is empty of self. The Buddha also teaches us that all phenomena is empty of self-nature as well. And yet we are compulsively and obsessively involved in the perpetuation of a myth that one can manipulate, that one, who is an artificial construction, can manipulate external circumstances and external phenomena in order to achieve a goal, in order to achieve any goal, and of course, in order specifically to achieve the goal of happiness. And anytime we find ourselves involved in that process, which is constantly, we should think of those people, doing the backstroke in the dust, trying to pretend that they're in the pool, having a good time. It is an excellent illustration of that process. In this belief in self-nature as being inherently real, in this constant fixation and obsession with self-nature, in this constant compulsion to manipulate circumstances and therefore cause circumstances to appear solid and real, even though in fact they are not, we find ourselves in a pickle, something like a stew of habitual tendencies that lead to no good end, that only increase confusion. We find ourselves constantly involved, compulsively, in activity that has nothing to do with happiness. Because in the depth of this involvement, in the thick of it, one cannot know one's true nature. One cannot know that nature which is empty of self. One cannot know that nature which is clear, luminous, innately wakeful, free of all distinction, free of all contrivance. Because the mind is covered over with the compulsion and the delusion and the artificial construction of self-nature. Yet that nature, that is our true nature, that undefiled primordial wisdom state, is synonymous with bliss. It is the very definition of joy. It is without limitation. And most importantly, it is without the necessary building blocks by which one can construct suffering. That nature is called the nature, that which is free of suffering. That nature is called the cessation of suffering. And the awakening to that nature, that is called enlightenment. Not the gathering of facts, not the accumulation of knowledge, not the reading of many books, not the being this way or acting that way or dressing up with this or that. It is the realization of that nature which can only be achieved by the pacification of that fixation on self-nature, the artificial construction, and the distinction between self and other called the mind of duality. That is how that nature is perceived. One cannot be fixated on one's own nature and be enlightened. It's a very easy way to determine for yourself whether you are looking at a person who has really accomplished their practice. Many people, when they first come into the path, and sadly, many people as they continue on the path, and even after they have practiced a great deal, never quite get this one. They think that it's all about being a great being, or being the New Age, what is the New Age catch-all phrase? A very old soul, my favorite. Not really my favorite, for those of you that are just buying the tape. I wanted to make that very clear. It seems as though we do not understand, and we somehow use our practice, use our spirituality, use our lives, sadly, to perpetuate the causes for more suffering. We continue to remain fixated on artificial construction of self, not realizing that one must pacify that process. We continually remain fixated on the idea that we can manipulate circumstances in order to get happy somehow, as though happiness were a commodity rather than the purification of the causes of suffering, as though happiness were a thing one could hold rather than the alleviation of those things which are compulsive and distorted. The alleviation, in fact, of the belief in the inherent reality of self and other. According to the Buddha, there is only one lasting happiness, and that lasting happiness is called the state of enlightenment. And that state of enlightenment is to awaken to the state that is beyond suffering, to the state that does not have the components of suffering, to the blissful state of the realization of one's own primordial wisdom nature. That is the only lasting happiness. But we manage to delude ourselves and think that we're getting something, and we go for that, boy, it's like a cookie. We want that cookie. We smell it baking and we want it. And we don't realize that eventually the cookie will make us sick because it's really not good for us. So we think, well, let's see now. I want this, so I'm going to have this. See this? I like this crystal. I want this crystal. So I'm going to have this crystal. And I somehow have contrived that in order to have this crystal, if I have this crystal, I will be happy. And for the moment that I take this crystal, there's a feeling of success. I bought it, I've got it, it's mine. There's a feeling of success. And there's just the tiniest moment of satisfaction of some kind. But what we manage to ignore is that satisfaction doesn't last long at all. How long does it last? 30 seconds, a minute. I've never even seen it last a week. Somehow, though, we do not understand that. Those of us that experience a lot of inner confusion manage to convince ourselves that if we can just keep having things, or doing things, or are creating approval, having approval, winning, being on top, if we can just keep doing them one right after another, we can keep above it. Those of us that have done perhaps a little practice or somehow have the great blessing of a little space in our minds might think, I feel a little sick inside. It ain't working. It just isn't happening. It's hard to say what state we're in. It's hard to say what level we're at. And we can delude ourselves into thinking we're better off than we are. It's better for all of us to think of ourselves, much better, for all of us, advanced practitioners or not, to think of ourselves as the people swimming in the dust, and to think how stupid it is to convince yourself that you are refreshed. So I'm going to wind up this class by telling you a story. My husband has asked me to give him credit for this, so I think I have to. I never give him credit for the other things I plagiarize from him, but of the two of us, he has the much better sense of humor. This is a story that I'll tell you because it's so sad that the only way to hear it and not cry is to make it useful for other sentient beings. It's really sad. But you should think that right now we're turning it into something beneficial, and therefore it has served a purpose. I have been away for 2 weeks just about, and have been with my family for part of the time at the beach. It has been our vacation. My husband went to a bookstore, one of those New Age bookstores, and he wanted to see what they had. So he went to the bookstore, and somehow I'd gotten into a conversation with the person who works in the bookstore or runs it or owns it, I don't know what. I wasn't there, so I may get some of the details wrong. But one thing led to another, and I think the man had some Tibetan item, I think a gao for sale, a gao, a very large gao. And my husband commented on it, and that's what led to the conversation. And finally, the man said that there are no more gaos in the world, that this is very strange, which is very strange because I've been to Nepal and there are many gaos in the world. But this man continued to act in a very expert way, about these things. And my husband finally said, or the man finally asked my husband, well, where are you from? And he said, from Poolesville. He said, I attend a very large Buddhist temple in Poolesville, which is right outside of Washington. And the man said, Poolesville, where's that? And he said, well, it's right outside of Washington, and the name of the place is Kunzang Otsal Peyul Changchub Cholding. And the man said, what do you do there? And he said, well, we're a Tibetan Buddhist temple. He said, well, what is your purpose? My husband said, to practice and learn Tibetan Buddhism. And he said, well, but what is your purpose? And he went, to practice and learn Tibetan Buddhism. And the guy said, well, do you have anyone that's qualified? Do you keep up the tradition? And he said, yes, we practice and learn Tibetan Buddhism. And the man said, well, do you have a teacher there that's qualified to teach that? And he said, yes, we have many visiting Tibetan lamas, and our resident lama there is Ahkon Lhamo, who is the first woman, blah, 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 and told that, and mentioned something about that. And he said, oh, yes, I know her. And so so my husband said, have you met her? Have you been to our temple? And he said, no, I know her. And he gave that funny smile that is unique to the pseudo-omniscient. And he didn't say that he was my husband, you understand. So this thing is getting worse and worse. So what was that you just said? So this man said, I know her. And he said, well, how do you know her? And he said, well, isn't she the one that comes from Florida? And I did live in Florida until I was 19. The trouble is that that is more than 20 years ago, and this man doesn't look like he could be over 20. And my husband said, well, do you know her from Florida? And he said, let's just say that I know her. And he said, well, she hasn't lived in Florida for a long time, probably longer than you are old. And he said, I know her. And he said, well, why don't you come to our center and visit? And he said, it isn't necessary. Now, the sad thing about this story is that it is an indication of something that we do when we are sincerely trying to live a spiritual life. And I'm sure the man is sincerely trying to live a spiritual life. We do not examine ourselves. We do not understand. First of all, I don't think that he had the proper teaching by which to understand that even though he's running a New Age bookstore, and even though he probably is able to order wonderful New Age books for wonderful people, that he himself is not practicing the proper technology in order to accomplish the cessation of suffering. That in fact, because of his attitude and because of his rigidity, he is perpetuating his suffering in a most awful way. To put oneself in that fixation on ego, to put oneself in that posture, to make one's ego more rigid and more grandiose, to think of oneself in that prideful way. Most of us think that that will make us feel happy, that somehow if we do that, other people will look up to us, that somehow we will have approval. We think that we will get happy that way, and I'm certain that this man sincerely believed that he would be happy if he impressed himself and others in that way. I'm certain of it. And I'm sure that his motivation is good. I'm sure that he really wants to be helpful in some way. Yet he is busily digging himself in deeper and deeper, busily fixating on that prideful ego, having it become more and more rigid, more and more compulsive, more and more the ruler of his life. No one ever has produced the cessation of suffering through the method of reinforcing the ego and thereby reinforcing the distinction or the duality between self and other. No one has achieved the cessation of suffering by deepening their delusion. No one has ever achieved the cessation of suffering by becoming more and more fixated on self-nature. And so this man is involved with spirituality. He probably does some form of meditation, probably does something that is spiritual, and probably is very sincere, and yet he is hurting himself in a very profound way. It's really a sad story, isn't it? I mean, if you think about it. Somehow, though, if we use this story to see how much like this man we are, to see how many of those kinds of qualities we have, whether in a big, boastful way or in a small, tiny way, when we're alone by ourselves and our little pride comes out, we should try to understand that no one has ever gotten happy that way. Not ever. And whether we do it in a big way or in a noticeable way, as this man does, or whether we do it in the quiet, sneaky little ways that we do in our private moments, it isn't possible to be free of suffering by acting like that. One has to adapt an attitude of sincerity. And the only way that one can realistically do that is if we understand how suffering happens and accept that we and all sentient beings wish to not suffer anymore, that we wish to be happy. And we must come to understand for ourselves how we can produce the causes that will bring about happiness. What is the antidote to that kind of rigidity? What is the antidote to that fixation on self? What is the antidote to that compulsion to think of self as being especially wonderful or big or real or something? Simply put, the antidote is love. The antidote is something that is foundational and basic to this path. It is compassion. Loving kindness toward all sentient beings. A greater interest in their well-being than in our own. What if this same man, out of the blue, had had the wonderful insight to realize that it was more important to make my husband, the patron, who we didn't know was my husband, the patron of the bookshop, comfortable than it was to demonstrate how wonderful he is? What if he had been gracious enough to ask interested questions about this temple? Something small like that. Don't you think it would have produced happiness more easily than the action that he did take? What about we ourselves? In our interactions with others, have we thought it is more important that others be happy now? Have we assumed an attitude of generosity? Have we thought that it's more important that what we do produces good for others than that it is satisfying to ourselves? This attitude of generosity actually produces happiness. What is the cause of suffering? The cause of suffering is the belief in self-nature as being inherently real. It is the cause of suffering is also the belief that all phenomena is inherently real, and therefore the blindness to one's own nature. The cause of happiness, therefore, cannot be the accentuation and fixation upon that self-nature. And every time we become involved in that process, we are actually producing the causes of more suffering. The causes of happiness, then, are generosity, are developing a sense of spaciousness within one's mind. The ultimate cause of happiness is to realize one's own primordial wisdom nature. It is the only true and lasting cause of happiness, and the only method by which that will be achieved is by pacifying all fixation on self. So that every moment we try to get happy, and this is hard to think about, isn't it? Every moment we try to get happy, we are making ourselves more unhappy. We are actually producing within our minds the seed, the karma of some future unhappiness, because our minds are deeply fixated on self. And yet the more we work to benefit sentient beings, the more we are generous, the more we love unconditionally, the more we engage in activity that will someday bring about the cessation of suffering for all sentient beings, even though it may be effortful, the more we are planting the karma or the seed for the time of enlightenment and the time of future happiness. It's very hard to think about. But we must settle this issue in our mind so that we engage in the proper kind of activity, rather than in the activity that we engage in now. We must slowly, slowly, and piece by piece, change our course of action. Otherwise, we can keep ourselves on the wheel of death and rebirth for a very long time, deluding ourselves into thinking that we are getting ahead, that we are making progress. The only true progress is to get off the wheel completely. And one gets off the wheel completely by realizing and awakening to the precious state of enlightenment, one's own primordial wisdom nature. That is the state without suffering, and it is the end of suffering. In conclusion, Lord Buddha teaches us that there is an end to suffering, and that is that end. The truth of cessation is hope, is the only hope that one is truly allowed on this path. And so I hope that you will take that hope and hold it in your heart and make it the lamp that guides you, the only one, so that you don't throw yourself into the mud or the dust and find yourself kicking and thrashing around trying to convince yourself that you are happy and refreshed. But rather, register in the place with the pool. That is about the corniest last line I've ever made for a lecture. It's just that I love that commercial so much. But I want you to know I realize how corny that was.
To